My wealthy next-door neighbor stood on my porch, laughing hysterically while pointing at my modest 1920s craftsman house in front of 3 city code enforcement officers. He publicly called my home an eyesore, claiming my vintage residence was severely tanking his multi-million-dollar modern mansion's market value. For 6 straight months, he used his high-powered real estate lawyers, illegal construction crews, and endless formal city complaints to try to force me out of my neighborhood. He was completely convinced that a quiet, working-class guy living in an old house would simply crumble under legal pressure, forfeit his land, and run away. But what my arrogant neighbor didn't realize was that I wasn't just some helpless homeowner clinging to an old building. While he was busy throwing illegal eviction notices and smug insults at my face, I was quietly digging through century-old land registry archives and historical city deeds. The moment his high-priced attorney served me with a final, aggressive lawsuit to seize my driveway, his face went entirely ghost white when he read the original 1918 land grant charter. My neighbor didn't just fail to take my house. He was about to discover that I owned the ground beneath his entire street. My name is Caleb. At 27 years old, while most people my age were renting cramped downtown apartments or chasing high corporate promotions, I spent my weekends painstakingly restoring quarter-sawn oak trim and hand-fitting brass window latches. I work as an architectural preservationist, a job that requires equal parts historical research, structural engineering, and endless patience. To me, old buildings aren't just piles of aging timber and stone. They're living historical archives, built by craftsmanship that modern cookie-cutter developments could never replicate. 3 years ago, my grandfather passed away and left me his prized possession, a single-story 1920s craftsman bungalow sitting on a generous half-acre lot at the end of Oak Ridge Lane. The home had a wide covered porch, exposed cedar rafters, a massive stone fireplace, and a deep front garden filled with mature heirloom roses my grandmother had planted in the 1960s. For decades, our quiet cul-de-sac had been a peaceful, tight-knit sanctuary where longtime residents respected each other's privacy and appreciated the neighborhood's historical charm. Everything changed the morning an aging widow down the street sold her property to a high-end corporate redeveloper. Enter Harrison Sterling. Harrison was a 42-year-old commercial real estate speculator who wore custom-tailored suits, drove a matte black European SUV, and treated every interaction like a corporate takeover. He didn't buy the adjacent plot to live in the charming existing cottage. He bought it to flatten it. Within 2 weeks, heavy machinery roared into our quiet street, tearing down the historic home in a cloud of dust and diesel exhaust. In its place, Harrison began constructing an aggressive, 4-story modern monstrosity. It was a sprawling maze of black steel beams, frameless glass walls, and stark, industrial concrete that towered over my humble craftsman bungalow like a fortress. He didn't build a home to blend into the community. He built a monument to his own ego. From the moment the heavy equipment arrived, Harrison made his disdain for my property crystal clear. He would stand on his rising second-story balcony in his polished dress shoes, glaring down at my vintage Ford truck and my wooden porch with visible disgust. To a man whose entire identity was built on hypermodern luxury and flashing wealth, my meticulously preserved craftsman house was nothing more than an ugly, low-value obstacle spoiling his million-dollar view. Harrison made it clear from day one that my historic craftsman house didn't fit his vision of luxury, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. The tension that had been simmering finally boiled over on a warm Saturday afternoon in early June. I was knelt in my front yard, kneeling in the soft soil with canvas gardening gloves, carefully pruning my grandmother's vintage tea rose bushes. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh blooms, a peaceful routine I had cherished for years. But that peace was shattered when a fleet of black valet-parked luxury sedans began lining up along Oak Ridge Lane. Harrison was hosting a lavish housewarming party to show off his newly completed glass and steel mansion. Dozens of wealthy guests filled his upper deck, men in tailored linen jackets and women clutching designer handbags, sipping champagne against the backdrop of the setting sun. I kept my head down, focusing on my work and trying my best to ignore the loud, performative laughter drifting from next door. That was until I heard heavy footsteps approaching the low stone wall separating our properties. "Hey, Vance!" Harrison's voice boomed across the yard. carrying a sharp, patronizing edge designed specifically to draw an audience. I paused my shears and looked up. Harrison stood on the elevated lawn, holding a crystal wine glass, surrounded by 4 of his high society guests who were all looking down at me with condescending smirks. "You know, Caleb," Harrison said, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear, "I was just telling my investors here that every luxury neighborhood has its one tragic flaw. Ours happens to be right there." He gestured lazily with his glass toward my Craftsman bungalow. A few quiet giggles broke out among his guests. My pulse quickened, but I remained knelt on the ground, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "It's an eyesore, man," Harrison continued, stepping closer to the boundary line. "A complete shanty. You're single. You're young. Why are you clinging to this crumbling wooden relic? You've got paint peeling off the eaves, and that ancient truck in your driveway looks like a junkyard throwaway. It's a neighborhood disease, Caleb. Your little hobby house is actively tanking my property value by at least 15%. The public humiliation was calculated, vicious, and completely unprovoked. He wanted to make me feel small, to break my pride in front of an audience so I'd feel ashamed to stay." I slowly stood up, wiped the soil from my gloves, and looked Harrison dead in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout or drop to his level. "This house has stood strong for over a century, Harrison," I said calmly, my tone steady and unbothered. "It was built with integrity and craftsmanship that outlasts trends. I suggest you focus on your own property." Harrison's smug smirk flickered for a fraction of a second, clearly irritated that he hadn't forced an emotional outburst out of me. He took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes hardening into a cold, arrogant glare. I kept my head down and pruned my roses in silence, knowing that hot tempers always ruin cold strategies. When public humiliation failed to drive me out, Harrison switched strategies. He stopped throwing verbal insults over the wall and began weaponizing the city's bureaucratic system. He realized that a calm, quiet homeowner couldn't easily be provoked into a physical or verbal altercation. So he decided to make living in my own home an expensive, exhausting nightmare through legal harassment. It started on a Tuesday morning when an official city sedan pulled up to my curb. An officer from the Sacramento Code Enforcement Department stepped out, clipboard in hand, looking visibly embarrassed. Someone had filed an urgent formal complaint claiming my property was harboring illegal structural hazards, overgrown noxious weeds, and an unregistered commercial vehicle. I welcomed the officer politely, walked him through the entire yard, and showed him my vintage Ford truck's active registration and historical vehicle permit. I pointed out that my garden consisted of cultivated, historic rose bushes, not wild weeds, and that my porch timber was original quarter-sawn oak, structurally sound and completely rot-free. The inspector checked every box on his sheet, apologized for wasting my morning, and signed off on a clean inspection report. Harrison wasn't satisfied. Over the next 6 weeks, city inspectors appeared at my door nearly twice a week. One day, it was a complaint about alleged unpermitted electrical work in my detached garage. The next week, it was an anonymous report claiming my chimney was emitting toxic fumes. After that came a complaint alleging my gravel driveway was causing illegal water runoff onto adjacent parcels during rainstorms. Every single time, I calmly opened my gate, presented my pristine permits and professional restoration records, and satisfied the city's requirements without receiving a single dollar in fines. From my front window, I would watch Harrison standing on his upper balcony, gripping his cell phone while watching the inspectors leave my driveway empty-handed. His face would flush red with frustration as he realized his political calls to municipal offices weren't producing the swift citations or eviction notices he had anticipated. By the end of July, the city code enforcement director personally called me to apologize, informing me that they were flagging Harrison's account for abusing the public complaint system. Every legal avenue he tried to use to force me out ended in a dead end. But Harrison wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. He was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted through brute force and financial intimidation. When the city refused to fine me, Harrison decided to take the law into his own illegal hands. The escalation moved from administrative warfare to direct physical trespass on a scorching Thursday afternoon in early August. I was working at my kitchen table, reviewing Blue Line restoration schematics for a historic downtown library project, when the violent vibration of heavy machinery rattled my glass windows. The deep, rhythmic thud of a hydraulic jackhammer echoed directly outside my bedroom wall. I stepped onto my porch and stopped dead in my tracks. A rogue third-party paving crew hired by Harrison had pulled a skid-steer loader and an industrial asphalt cutter directly onto my gravel driveway. Without warning or prior notice, the crew was violently tearing up the edge of my property, smashing the historic, century-old red clay brick border my grandfather had hand-laid in 1955. They were carving a deep, jagged trench 2 full feet past our established boundary line. I pulled out my smartphone, hit record to capture a clear, time-stamped video feed of the machinery, and walked deliberately toward the site foreman. "Stop work immediately," I shouted over the deafening noise of the engine, holding my phone high to document the skid-steer operator's face. "You are actively destroying private property and trespassing across a residential lot line. Cease operations until an official boundary survey is produced." The foreman looked uncomfortable, glancing back toward Harrison's glass mansion. Before he could speak, the heavy glass front door of the mansion swung open. Harrison marched down his landscaped steps, wearing sunglasses and a smug, mocking grin, waving a dismissive hand at his crew. "Ignore him and keep digging," Harrison barked at the workers. He turned to face me, stepping directly into my personal space with aggressive posture. "Let's get something straight, Caleb. My luxury sports cars need a wider turning radius to enter my 3-car garage smoothly. Your pathetic gravel path is an eyesore anyway. I'm doing this street a favor by paving over your dirt." "You don't have a permit to touch my land, Harrison," I said, holding my phone steady, capturing his face in crisp high definition. "This brick border is listed on my property deed. You are committing intentional property destruction." Harrison threw his head back and laughed, a cold, mocking sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Document it all you want, kid. Call your little lawyers. Call the police. I have a team of corporate attorneys on retainer who make $500 an hour. By the time you get a court date, my asphalt will be dry, and you'll be bankrupt from legal fees trying to fight me." He stepped even closer, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "I own the aesthetic of this entire block now, Caleb. If you don't like it, sell your dump and get out." He told me to take him to court if I didn't like it, unaware that I was about to do something far worse. Instead of screaming back or starting a screaming match in the middle of the street, I turned around, walked back inside my quiet craftsman home, and locked the front door behind me. My heart was pounding, but my mind was completely crystal clear. As an architectural preservationist, I spent half my career working with historical land surveys, municipal deeds, and city development blueprints. I knew that when wealthy developers run over property lines, they rely entirely on the assumption that normal homeowners are too ignorant, intimidated, or broke to verify the legal reality. Early the very next morning, before the summer sun could heat the pavement, I drove straight to the Sacramento County Recorder's office in downtown. The air inside the basement archives was cool, smelling faintly of old paper, leather bindings, and decades of dust. A silver-haired clerk named Martha, who had worked the registry desk for over 30 years, smiled as I presented my grandfather's original house deed. I explained that I needed to inspect the complete, unabridged historical conveyance chain for the entire Oak Ridge Lane tract, dating back to its original municipal subdivision. Martha led me down into the vault section, pulling a pair of massive, brass-bound leather ledgers from the reinforced metal shelves. These weren't digital records stored on modern cloud servers. These were hand-drawn 1918 land grant blueprints, Blue Line Civil Survey maps, and ink-signed estate conveyances preserved under thick glass plates. I spent 4 continuous hours under the humming fluorescent lights, spreading the yellowed blueprints across a large oak table, carefully examining every surveyor's mark, benchmark stake, and parcel boundary line with a magnifying lens. Most people looking at property records only check their basic lot dimensions, the simple box outlining their backyard. But my professional training taught me to read the legal notes written in faded cursive along the margins, the easement reservations, private access covenants, and original developer land dedications. I cross-referenced my grandfather's 1952 purchase agreement with the original 1918 master land charter for Oak Ridge Lane. As I lined up the historic civil engineer's stamps and tracked the chain of title transfer, my fingers froze over a specific section of hand-drawn survey ink. As I unfolded the yellowed 1918 land charter map, my eyes landed on a legal clause that completely changed everything. The clause was buried deep within a private subdivision conveyance agreement signed in November 1918. Back then, Oak Ridge Lane was built as a private estate access road servicing a single agricultural parcel owned by a local timber magnate. When the land was eventually divided into individual residential lots in 1952, the original owner refused to dedicate the road, utility channels, or subsurface ground rights to the city of Sacramento. Instead, he sold the fee-simple title of the entire physical street tract directly to my grandfather. My heart pounded against my ribs as I read the explicit legal language. My grandfather hadn't just purchased the half-acre parcel under my Craftsman bungalow. He had purchased the fee-simple title to the underlying land structure of the entire six-home cul-de-sac. Because the city had never formally executed a municipal dedication or eminent domain buyout, Oak Ridge Lane remained a privately owned, fee-simple access corridor. While the other 6 homes on the block held valid deeds for their private residential plots, their driveways, front sidewalk connections, and underground main water and sewer tie-ins were legally sitting on a private easement leased exclusively through my grandfather's estate deed. More importantly, the historic deed contained strict maintenance covenants and explicit development restrictions. Any unapproved structural alteration, heavy vehicle commercial traffic, or unpermitted paving across the private street tract automatically triggered a severe easement default clause, granting the fee-simple owner the absolute legal right to revoke access rights or levy private usage fees. When Harrison Sterling bought his plot, his high-priced real estate lawyers had performed a superficial title search, assuming Oak Ridge Lane was a standard public municipal street managed by the city. They never bothered to dig into the 1918 private access charter buried in the county archives vault. They simply assumed that a wealthy corporate developer could pave over whatever ground he pleased without checking who actually owned the soil beneath his feet. I leaned back in the wooden chair of the archive room, a slow, calculated smile spreading across my face. Harrison had built a 4-story, multi-million-dollar modern glass mansion, complete with an illegal wide asphalt driveway, heavy utility tie-ins, and luxury stone entry gates. But he had constructed all of it on a private easement that he did not own, without obtaining written consent from the title holder. Harrison's million-dollar mansion, his pristine driveway, and his underground main lines were sitting on land he didn't own. Instead of rushing out to confront Harrison or shouting about my historical discovery, I chose absolute, disciplined silence. In high-stakes property litigation, giving away your leverage too early is the fastest way to let a wealthy opponent find a legal loophole. I played the part of the defeated, helpless victim perfectly. When Harrison's asphalt crew returned the following morning to pour fresh black tar over my destroyed red brick border, I stood silently on my porch, holding a steaming mug of coffee, watching them work without saying a single word. Harrison came out to inspect the job, wearing his dark sunglasses and a triumphant, arrogant smirk. He glanced in my direction, clearly expecting me to yell, beg, or call the police again. When I simply took a quiet sip of coffee and walked back inside, he practically strutted across his lawn, completely convinced that he had broken my spirit and forced me into submission. While Harrison was busy celebrating his stolen 2 feet of land, I was quietly putting together a bulletproof legal offense. That afternoon, I drove to downtown Sacramento to meet with Arthur Pendleton, a veteran municipal real estate and land litigation attorney with over 35 years of experience handling high-profile California property disputes. Sitting in Arthur's mahogany-paneled office, I spread the certified copies of the 1918 land grant charter, the 1952 deed transfers, and the county recorder's official seal across his desk. I also played the crisp, high-definition video of Harrison ordering his crew to pave over my brick border while claiming he owned the aesthetic of the block. Arthur put on his reading glasses and read through the century-old legal language with meticulous care. As he traced his finger along the private easement, default clauses, and fee-simple title conveyance, a slow, Razor-sharp smile spread across the old lawyer's face. "Caleb," Arthur said, leaning back in his leather chair and setting the papers down. "Your neighbor's legal team made a monumental mistake. They assumed Oak Ridge Lane was dedicated municipal land. By paving over your border, expanding his driveway access, and altering the street drainage without your written authorization as fee-simple title holder, he hasn't just committed simple trespass. He has actively triggered the default provisions of the entire street tract covenant." Arthur immediately submitted our certified documents to the County Land Registry for an expedited title audit, establishing our official priority claim before Harrison's attorneys could catch wind of what was happening. I let Harrison celebrate his stolen 2 feet, knowing he was walking straight into a legal quagmire. 3 days after Harrison's crew completed their illegal paving job, a formal legal process server in a stiff navy suit marched up my Craftsman steps and handed me a thick, red-stamped legal envelope. Harrison was taking his harassment campaign to its ultimate, aggressive conclusion. I opened the document on my kitchen counter. It was a formal civil petition for an emergency preliminary injunction, drafted by Harrison's high-priced corporate law firm, Sterling and Associates. The suit alleged that my historic 1920s Craftsman home constituted an active aesthetic nuisance that was causing severe and irreparable financial devaluation to Harrison's adjacent multi-million-dollar development project. Attached to the petition was a mandatory, high-pressure buyout demand. Harrison was offering an insultingly low cash sum, less than 40% of my home's actual market value, giving me a strict 48-hour ultimatum to sign over my property deed or face a drawn-out, ruinous civil trial. His lead attorney had even included a patronizing cover letter claiming that a young, working-class guy like me could never survive 3 months of corporate litigation fees, strongly advising me to surrender quietly. I immediately called Arthur Pendleton and scanned the entire filing to his office. Over the speakerphone, Arthur let out a rich, hearty laugh that echoed through my quiet living room. "Caleb," Arthur said cheerfully, "they have completely overplayed their hand. They think they're backing a scared kid into a corner with scare tactics. They have no idea that by filing this formal injunction in county court, they've opened up an expedited evidentiary hearing where title jurisdiction must be established immediately. By filing for an emergency injunction, Harrison's legal team had unwittingly placed the boundary and land ownership dispute directly in front of a senior Superior Court judge on a fast-tracked court docket. They thought they were backing me into a corner to force a quick surrender. Instead, they had handed us the exact formal forum we needed to unveil our certified 1918 land grant records. I signed Arthur's formal counterpetition, attached the certified county recorder's land audit, and prepared for the upcoming emergency hearing. His lawyer thought he was delivering a death blow. Instead, he handed us the exact legal green light we needed to respond. The morning air inside Department 42 of the Sacramento County Superior Court was thick with formal tension. The courtroom featured high oak paneling, heavy brass chandeliers, and the crisp sound of pages shuffling across wooden counsel tables. Harrison Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a bespoke charcoal Italian suit, a gold watch glinting under the recessed lights. Surrounding him were 3 corporate attorneys from Sterling and Associates, their polished leather briefcases overflowing with glossy architectural renderings and property assessment binders. Harrison sat back in his leather chair with an air of absolute invincibility, casually whispering to his lead attorney as if the entire proceeding was merely a scheduled administrative formality. On our side of the aisle, Arthur Pendleton and I sat quietly. I wore a simple navy blazer and held a single leather folder containing our certified county land registry documents. Arthur sat perfectly composed, his calm posture projecting the quiet confidence of a seasoned trial lawyer who knew the exact location of the trapdoor. Judge Evelyn Richter, a formidable senior magistrate known for her sharp legal mind and zero-tolerance attitude toward frivolous litigation, took her bench and adjusted her glasses. "We are here on Department Case 24CV, Judge Richter announced, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. Plaintiff Harrison Sterling petitions for an emergency preliminary injunction against defendant Caleb Vance, alleging property nuisance, aesthetic devaluation, and intentional interference with commercial development. Harrison's lead attorney stood up immediately, adjusting his tie with theatrical confidence. He spent 15 uninterrupted minutes delivering a polished, aggressive opening statement. He painted Harrison as a visionary community investor who had poured millions into upgrading the street's infrastructure, while depicting me as a stubborn, unreasonable homeowner whose aging 1920s bungalow was actively sabotaging neighboring land values. He proudly presented photographs of Harrison's expanded asphalt driveway, claiming his client was acting entirely within his civil rights to maintain and improve the access corridors of Oak Ridge Lane. Throughout the entire speech, Harrison was practically smirking at me from across the aisle, until my attorney stood up to submit Exhibit A. Arthur Pendleton rose to his feet with deliberate, practiced calm. He buttoned his suit jacket, smoothed his tie, and approached the podium holding our certified, gold-stamped county land audit. "Your Honor," Arthur began, his resonant voice commanding absolute stillness across the courtroom. "The plaintiff's petition rests entirely on a fundamental, fatal misapprehension of real property law. Mr. Sterling claims my client is interfering with a municipal access corridor. But we submit into evidence Exhibit A, the certified 1918 fee simple land grant charter and the official 1952 county title audit for the Oak Ridge Lane subdivision." Arthur walked over to the bailiff, handing copies directly to the judge, while passing a set to Harrison's lead attorney. "As these certified public registry records demonstrate," Arthur continued, "Oak Ridge Lane was never dedicated as a public municipal street. The physical roadbed, the underlying soil structure, and the subsurface utility channels are owned in fee simple absolute by my client, Mr. Caleb Vance, as inherited from the Vance estate." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over Department 42. Judge Richter leaned forward, her sharp gaze scanning the historical blue line maps and the county recorder's raised official seal. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, measured tone, "are you asserting that the entire access road servicing the plaintiff's property is a private fee simple tract owned by the defendant?" "Precisely, Your Honor," Arthur replied smoothly. "Furthermore, by paving over Mr. Vance's established border, expanding his driveway footprint, and altering the street's drainage without written authorization from the title holder, Mr. Sterling has committed direct structural trespass and triggered the mandatory default provisions of the 1918 Covenant." Across the aisle, the smug confidence evaporated from Harrison's face in a single instant. His lead attorney fumbled frantically through his own thick binders, his hands visibly trembling as his eyes darted across the certified deed clauses Arthur had provided. He whispered frantically to Harrison, whose face drained of all color until he looked like a ghost. The high-priced corporate legal team realized in real time that they had spent millions constructing a luxury mansion on land where they didn't even hold basic access authorization. The judge's eyebrows shot up, and Harrison's lawyer turned entirely pale as he skimmed the certified land deed. Judge Richter didn't waste a single second. She removed her glasses, set them heavily on her bench, and leveled a piercing look at Harrison's legal team. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. "In 32 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such egregious due diligence negligence," Judge Richter declared, her voice cold and cutting. "Plaintiff's counsel came into my court demanding an emergency injunction to protect a multi-million-dollar structure, without ever verifying if their client actually possessed lawful title or recorded access rights to the underlying ground." Harrison's lead attorney stood up, his hands visibly shaking as he attempted to stammer an excuse. "Why, Your Honor, my client proceeded under the reasonable belief that Oak Ridge Lane was a dedicated municipal thoroughfare. A belief is not a property deed, Counselor," Judge Richter interrupted forcefully, striking her bench with her hand. "Your client took heavy machinery onto land owned fee simple by Mr. Vance, destroyed historical property markers, and altered private drainage without title authorization. That is not municipal improvement. That is willful, actionable trespass." She reached for her pen and began signing formal court orders with decisive, heavy strokes. "First," Judge Richter announced, "the plaintiff's petition for a preliminary injunction against Mr. Vance is dismissed with prejudice. Second, this court issues an immediate, mandatory stop work order halting all construction, paving, and vehicle access across the private street tract owned by Mr. Vance. Third, I am ordering a full, independent court-monitored land and utility easement audit to be completed within 14 calendar days. She looked directly over her bench at Harrison, who was practically hyperventilating in his tailored Italian suit. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Richter warned sternly, "if a single piece of construction equipment touches that private street tract before this title audit is finalized, I will hold you in direct civil contempt and issue an immediate warrant for your arrest. We are adjourned." Harrison suddenly leaped up from his chair, his face turning bright crimson. "You can't block my driveway. That mansion cost me $4 million, he shouted in desperation. Judge Richter slammed her wooden gavel down with a deafening crack that echoed like a gunshot through the room. Harrison tried to shout out in protest, but the judge slammed her gavel down with a warning of contempt. Armed with Judge Richter's binding court order and the certified county title audit, Arthur Pendleton and I didn't waste a single moment feeling sorry for Harrison. The court had established, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that I held the fee simple absolute title to the entire physical street corridor of Oak Ridge Lane. It was time to exercise my full, lawful rights as the sole owner of the land beneath my neighbor's feet. 4 days after the explosive court hearing, Arthur drafted a comprehensive, highly formal legal package. It was delivered directly to Harrison Sterling's personal residence and his corporate headquarters by a certified courier service. The package contained 3 distinct, legally binding notices. First was a formal notice of revocation for unpermitted easement access. Because Harrison had breached the 1918 covenant by altering the street's drainage and paving over my historic brick border without title holder approval, his automatic access rights had been officially declared in default. Second was an itemized retroactive land rent invoice. The 1918 charter explicitly allowed the title holder to levy fair market private access and utility traversal fees against any commercial entity or developer using the street tract without an active, written lease. Arthur's accounting team calculated the exact value based on the heavy construction equipment traffic, heavy commercial machinery usage, and illegal asphalt paving Harrison had conducted over the past 18 months. The invoice laid out the cold, hard numbers in precise detail. $120,000 for unapproved heavy vehicle commercial road degradation, $85,000 for unauthorized underground utility pipe placement, and $145,000 in retroactive land rent and easement restoration penalties. Third, and most devastatingly, was an immediate cease and desist against his utility service providers. Because Harrison's main water lines, sewer connections, and electrical conduit channels ran directly through my private street bed, he had 30 days to negotiate a formal, paid private easement lease, or face complete physical disconnection from the municipal grid. I watched through my front curtain as the courier handed the heavy legal package to Harrison on his front steps. Harrison ripped open the envelope right there on his lawn, expecting perhaps a minor court bill. As his eyes scanned the breakdown of charges, his jaw slowly dropped open. His face cycled through shock, disbelief, and complete, overwhelming panic. He had tried to bully me out of my modest craftsman home using fake code violations, only to find himself sitting on a multi-million-dollar modern estate that was legally unaccessible and utilities unsupported. The total retroactive access bill amounted to over $350,000, payable within 30 days or facing immediate access revocation. The arrogant facade Harrison had maintained for months crumbled overnight. Gone was the smug developer who laughed at my craftsman bungalow, threw wine-fueled insults from his upper deck, and threatened to ruin me with high-priced corporate attorneys. Confronted with $350,000 in retroactive land fees, an active court stop-work order, and the imminent shutoff of his home's utility connections, pure desperation took over. On a chilly Tuesday evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, a timid, hesitant knock echoed at my front door. I opened it to find Harrison standing on my porch. He wasn't wearing his Italian suits or designer sunglasses. He stood there in a rumpled hoodie and jeans, his hair disheveled, dark circles bruised under his eyes. For the first time since he bought the property, he looked me in the eye without condescension. "Caleb," he began, his voice cracking slightly, devoid of any past authority. "Please, we need to talk like reasonable neighbors. Can I come inside for a minute?" I didn't step aside. I stood calmly on my threshold, arms crossed, keeping my expression cool and detached. You can say whatever you have to say right here, Harrison. Harrison swallowed hard, nervously adjusting his collar. Look, I know things got completely out of hand. I acted poorly and I pushed too hard, but this utility disconnect notice, this $350,000 access fee, it's going to destroy me, Caleb. My lenders are threatening to call my primary construction mortgage if title encumbrance isn't cleared in 2 weeks. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handwritten paper document. I'm willing to offer you $500,000 cash today, right now, to purchase the physical road plot and grant my estate permanent, unrestricted access. That's more than double its assessed valuation. I looked at the piece of paper, then looked at Harrison's desperate, pleading eyes. Harrison, I said, my voice quiet, steady, and unshakable. When you stood on this porch 6 months ago in front of code inspectors, calling my grandfather's house a shanty and an eyesore, you told me that you owned the aesthetic of this block. You thought money bought the right to steamroll history, integrity, and normal people. Historic preservation and quiet living are not for sale. I declined his offer completely. I informed him that my attorney would only accept full payment of the court-sanctioned damages, along with a complete structural restoration of my property line. He stood on the same porch where he had mocked my house, realized his entire estate was unmarketable, and broke down. The financial collapse of Harrison Sterling's empire was swift, merciless, and completely self-inflicted. With my flat refusal to sell the private street tract, his luxury mansion became legally unmarketable. A property sitting on an encumbered private street with active utility disconnect notices and a binding court stop work order is a nightmare for any financial institution. Within 21 days of the court hearing, Harrison's primary commercial construction lender formally audited his title insurance policy. Discovering that his corporate attorneys had failed to secure valid street access or subsurface utility easements prior to construction, the bank declared him in technical default. They immediately froze his development accounts and demanded full repayment of his $4 million construction loan within 30 days. To satisfy the court order and avoid immediate civil arrest for contempt, Harrison was legally forced to hire a demolition crew at his own expense. I sat on my front porch, sipping hot tea, as heavy excavators pulled up to the property line. But this time, they weren't paving over my land. I watched as jackhammers tore up the illegal asphalt driveway extension, breaking apart the concrete footprint Harrison had arrogantly poured. Under the supervision of a court-appointed surveyor, his crew spent 3 full days carefully replacing every single red clay brick of my grandfather's historical driveway border, restoring my property line to its exact original 1955 condition. Without the capital to pay my $350,000 court-sanctioned damages and unable to refinance his loans, Harrison's development firm went into financial insolvency. The State Real Estate Board launched a formal professional inquiry into his firm's negligent title practices, shattering his corporate reputation across Northern California. 2 months later, a red and white bank foreclosure sign was hammered into the manicured front lawn of the glass and steel mansion. The multi-million-dollar modern structure was put up for a distressed lender auction. On a foggy Saturday morning in October, I watched from my porch as 3 large, yellow moving vans pulled into Oak Ridge Lane. Harrison stood near the back of a rental truck, dressed in a faded jacket, personally lifting cardboard boxes. He looked completely defeated, his shoulders slumped in total public humiliation. He refused to look toward my house or make eye contact with me as he packed away the last of his belongings. I watched from my craftsman porch as moving trucks packed away his furniture, while his modern glass house stood empty. With Harrison Sterling permanently gone, absolute peace returned to Oak Ridge Lane. The constant drone of illegal construction machinery, the aggressive concrete trucks, and the arrogant threats were replaced by the gentle rustle of pine needles in the autumn breeze and the sweet, familiar chirping of birds in the morning air. 6 months after the foreclosure auction, the empty glass mansion next door was purchased by a wonderful, soft-spoken family, an elderly retired high school history teacher and his wife. They were delighted by the historic character of our street and respected the craftsman heritage of my home. They even asked for my professional guidance on how to landscape their property so it would blend harmoniously with my grandmother's heirloom rose gardens. With the $350,000 in court-awarded damages collected from Harrison's liquidated business assets, I established the Vance Historic Preservation Trust, dedicated to protecting early 20th century residential architecture across Sacramento from predatory commercial redevelopers. Today, on a crisp, sunlit morning, I sit on my wide covered porch in a comfortable wooden rocking chair, taking a slow sip of hot, freshly brewed coffee. My vintage Ford truck sits neatly in the gravel driveway, framed by the restored red clay brick border my grandfather laid 7 decades ago. Looking down the street, I feel a profound sense of gratitude and quiet pride. Harrison thought his money, high-priced attorneys, and corporate intimidation gave him the right to rewrite property laws and stomp on normal people. But he learned the hard way that true power doesn't come from flashing wealth or screaming the loudest. True power comes from patience, clinical research, knowing your legal rights, and standing your ground with unwavering integrity. Now, I'm curious about you listening to my story. What would you have done if an arrogant neighbor tried to pave over your land and force you out of your home? Have you ever had to deal with an entitled bully in your own neighborhood? Comment below and let me know. And don't forget to mention the city or state you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. If you enjoyed this journey of legal justice, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. And remember, never let anyone make you feel small in your own sanctuary. Stay safe, stand strong, and I'll see you in the next story.